Hi, my name is Bob. Welcome to another edition of Conversations. We like to encourage conversations. We, meaning my wife, my friends, my family, our church. Conversations help us learn things, help us learn what other people are doing, give us a knowledge of who they are, what they think about, and so forth. Most of you probably have conversations around the dinner table, talking with your kids, or if it's just you and your wife, you sort of rehash the day, see how things are going, talk about a person's health. Hopefully you have a good conversation about that and just enjoy dinner time together while you're having this conversation. Seems like we've gotten into a mode or some sort of way of not handling conversations very well in our society, especially when we talk about really important things like political views. Unfortunately, political views get to the point where we don't really want to listen to the other person. And listening is really just as important as it is talking in a conversation, because you don't really fully know what another person is thinking until you fully listen to them and try to understand them. So we want to promote that kind of thing. And especially in the conversations that we're going to have over the next couple of weeks and months as we talk through the Gospel of John. This time, we would like to talk about the very first chapter of the Gospel of John. And I'm going to put up on the screen here and stop for just a moment so you can see the specific passage I want to talk about today. Okay, so now that you're back, after you've had a chance to take a look at that passage, you may even want to go back and read through the whole first chapter of John. But the first part of that chapter, to me, is what is critical. And it's critical because the way John starts his gospel is different from the way other writers of the Gospels start. Matthew and Luke, for example, always start with some birth narrative. Mark just gets right into the ministry of Christ. He doesn't even bother with any sort of introduction other than to say, here's who he is, and here's what he says, and then he goes right into his ministry. John, on the other hand, starts off by telling us exactly who he thinks Jesus is, exactly who his experiences tell him who Jesus is. He says in John chapter 1, verses 1 through 4, and then down in verse 14, that he was in the beginning, he was with God, he was God, all things were made through him, and he became flesh. Now you'll notice that what John does, he uses a word there, the word word, okay? That's a Greek phrase or a Greek terminology that would have meant something specific to the Greeks, but in fact, John is simply trying to say here, if the word became flesh, and then he goes on to talk about Jesus in the next part of his chapter, it's very clear that's who he's referring to. And what's important about that, I think, is that Jesus was there at creation. John the Baptist in this chapter even says that Jesus existed before he did. And if you go back and look at the birth narratives in the Gospel of Luke, John was born first. But John says Jesus existed before he did, and therefore he has the preeminence in everything. My point here is for us to just think about in terms of having a conversation about it. What does Jesus mean to you? Do you think he really was there at creation? John says he was, and John's going to give us some pretty strong evidence over the next 22 chapters of his lesson, of his gospel, to insist that this is exactly who Jesus was. It's a pretty profound statement. Not only was he creator, but he was and still is the source of life and light. And let's not forget, he became flesh. That's what the church has always called the doctrine of the incarnation. We think that has some very strong implications for what we do, for how we live, for what we believe. Should we believe in this Jesus? Should we follow him? Do we owe him our allegiance? If he was our creator, does he really know everything about us and what we are supposed to be and how we're supposed to live? Those are some questions I think that can be discussed and perhaps given some challenging answers as we think about what John is saying about Jesus. Read the whole first chapter. See how John the Baptist comes into play. See what his early disciples say and think about it. Have some conversation, and please make it a conversation. Be respectful of one another. Be prepared also for another edition of Conversations next week when we go into John chapter 2 and we talk about a wedding. See you next time.